Welcome to Still Unanswered. I'm Maya Cardinal. Today, we're taking a long, careful look at the Highway of Tears, the stretch of Highway 16 in northern British Columbia, where generations of Indigenous women and girls have gone missing or been murdered. This episode is somber, but it's meant to name things clearly, to listen to families, and to push for answers that have been delayed for decades. Leanne, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Maya. I appreciate you having me. It's important we keep talking about this in a way that centers families and acknowledges the history behind what people call the Highway of Tears.
So let's start with the basics. For listeners who haven't driven that road or read the reports, how do you describe the Highway of Tears? Where is it exactly?
Highway of Tears refers to a roughly 700 to 725 kilometer corridor of Highway 16 that runs between Prince George in the east and Prince Rupert on the coast. It cuts through dense forests, mountains, and a scatter of small towns and First Nations communities, places like Smithers, Burns Lake, Terrace. The landscape itself is remote, long stretches with few witnesses, little traffic at night, and until recently, very limited cell coverage. Those physical conditions become part of the story of why the corridor was so dangerous.
700 kilometers. That's huge. You can get swallowed up out there.
Exactly. And the road was completed around 1969. Not long after, families started noticing missing women and girls, young women who had been hitchhiking because they had no other options. The pattern emerged slowly, but then it became unmistakable.
The term Highway of Tears itself, where did that come from?
It was coined in 1998 during a vigil in Terrace by Florence Naziel, who used that image of the family's tears for their missing and murdered loved ones. The phrase resonated, and by the 2000s, it had become shorthand, not only for the stretch of highway, but for the crisis of violence against Indigenous women and girls in that region.
It's a simple phrase, but it carries a lot of weight. Leanne, you've worked in communities on and off the corridor. When families first started sounding the alarm, what did they see that made them say, this is different?
At first, it was a series of disappearances. The young women who didn't make it home or whose bodies were found in places where they shouldn't have been. Families noticed patterns. Many were Indigenous. Many were teenagers. Many were last seen hitchhiking between communities to get to school, work, or family. They also noticed something else, a kind of systemic dismissal when they reported someone missing. They were told a girl had likely run away or was off partying. Meanwhile, there were long distances without transit and very little official urgency in searching.
That dismissal is such an important thread, one that keeps coming up in family stories. So let's talk about numbers. I know there isn't a single agreed-upon total. Can you walk listeners through the official counts versus community counts?
Yes. The RCMP project, Project IPANA, officially linked 18 murder and disappearance cases between 1969 and 2000 across Highway 16, 97, and 5. Of those 18, 13 were teenagers. But Indigenous and community organizations estimate far more than 40 women and girls missing or murdered along Highway 16 alone in some counts. Some researchers and advocates suggest 80 or more when you include suspicious deaths, cases slightly outside IPANA's criteria, or those officially ruled accidental where families disagree. So you get 3 lists, really: the police list, the families list, and the broader community list.
3 lists. That gap between 18 and 40 or 80 feels like a story in itself.
It is. The criteria used by investigators were narrow. They focused on female victims, a so-called high-risk lifestyle like hitchhiking, and locations within roughly 1.6 kilometers of the major highways, and a time frame between 1969 and 2006. Those criteria exclude many women the community sees as part of the same pattern. Narrow definitions can make a problem look smaller and more solvable on paper, easier to manage politically, while obscuring the lived reality.
So the way we count matters. It changes urgency, funding, and public perception. Let's pivot to some of the individual cases people often know about, both because they're emblematic and because they're heartbreaking. Can you highlight a few that listeners should know, Leanne?
Yes. You can pick a handful as narrative anchors. For early cases, there's Helen Claire Frost, missing since October 13, 1970, after leaving home in downtown Prince George. She never returned. Monica Ignace was 14, last seen December 13, 1974, walking home in a snowstorm near Thornhill. Her body was found in April 1975, and she had been strangled. Those early cases set a pattern. In later years, there are cases like Roxanne Thiara, 15, found in 1994 in brush along Highway 16 east of Burns Lake, and Lana Derrick, 19, last seen in 1995 in Thornhill. And then there are cases that grabbed national attention, like Nikal Hoare, a 25-year-old tree planter from Alberta who disappeared in 2002 while hitchhiking from Prince George to Smithers. Her case drew more national media than many Indigenous cases, which families pointed to as evidence of a two-tiered valuation of victims.
Nikal Hoare. Many families talk about that disparity in coverage. And then there are the cases where known killers later emerged. Edward Dennis Isaac and Cody Lejabokoff are names people talk about. Can you explain their place in the story?
Yes. Edward Dennis Isaac was active in the early 1980s in and around Prince George, convicted of killings including Roswitha Fuchsbichler, 13, and Nina Joseph, 15. His modus operandi included picking up hitchhiking girls and extreme brutality. Cody Lejabokoff, arrested in 2010 and convicted in 2014, is one of Canada's youngest-known serial killers. He was convicted of murdering 4 women in northern BC, victims like Cynthia Moss and Natasha Montgomery. At least one of those victims is often grouped with Highway of Tears cases due to geography and victim profile. These are clear examples that predators, some serial, some opportunistic, have operated in the region. But, and this is crucial, investigations have generally concluded that there is not a single Highway of Tears killer. The pattern arises from multiple offenders over decades, aided by the corridor's conditions.
So it's both individual offenders and the environment that enabled them. Sorry, go ahead, Leanne.
No, that's right. Even if there isn't one killer, you can think of the system itself as functioning like a serial offender when it tolerates predictable violence, underfunds supports, and dismisses families.
Powerful point. Let's talk about Project Ipana. The RCMP set up that task force in 2005. What was its mandate, and how has it performed?
Ipana was launched by the RCMP to re-examine unsolved murders and disappearances of women and girls along major northern BC highways. Its aims included determining whether a serial killer was at work and identifying suspects. The project began with a small number of cases, but expanded. 3 cases at launch in 2005, 9 in 2006, and 18 by 2007. But EPANA has been criticized for its narrow criteria, the limited time frame it used, and for shrinking resources. Funding reportedly fell from more than $5 million a year in 2009-2010 to about $806,000 by 2013-14, an over 80% reduction. That resulted in fewer investigators and less capacity for cold case reviews. Families saw that as evidence of diminishing political will.
So, you had a task force that started with momentum and then lost steam, while families were still searching, still waiting. Leanne, we need to put this in a broader context. We often hear about colonialism, residential schools, the child welfare system. How do these connect to the Highway of Tears?
They're central. Residential schools, the 60s scoop, and ongoing overrepresentation of Indigenous children in foster care disrupted families and community structures. Survivors and their children often carry intergenerational trauma, higher rates of addictions, homelessness, and dislocation. Economic factors, land dispossession, resource extraction, boom and bust economies also destabilize communities. All of that increases vulnerability. Young women may be couch surfing, traveling for work or health appointments, lacking safe transportation, and more likely to be compelled to hitchhike. This is not just a policing problem. It's a set of overlapping colonial harms that make people more exposed to violence.
And yet, policing failures are incredibly visible in families' accounts. Delays in taking reports, victim blaming, and inconsistent investigations. How do those patterns show up in the Highway of Tears cases?
Families repeatedly report being told their missing relatives had run away or were living risky lifestyles, language that effectively deprioritized urgent responses. Investigative delays, slow to take missing person reports, slow to open files or to conduct searches, are a common complaint. Families often organize their own searches and put up billboards and memorials. There's also the clear comparative picture. When a non-Indigenous, white woman like Nikal Hoare disappeared, families and some researchers note more robust media and police response than in many Indigenous cases. That difference in response is part of the broader story of systemic racism in policing.
Right. It's painful to hear, but it's necessary to say. You mentioned families putting up billboards and doing their own searches. That activism coalesced into something bigger in 2006, didn't it?
Yes. In 2006, Carrier Sakani Family Services and community members organized the Highway of Tears Symposium in Prince George. Over 500 people attended: families, community leaders, service providers, some law enforcement and government officials. The symposium produced 33 recommendations focused on practical changes: transportation, emergency communication like cell coverage and call boxes, culturally appropriate policing and independent reviews, trauma-informed victim services, education, and socioeconomic supports like housing and employment.
Those 33 recommendations. Transportation was the top one, right?
Yes. Reliable, safe, affordable public transit along Highway 16 ranked high because lack of transit forced people to hitchhike. Improving emergency communications and ensuring missing person reports are acted on immediately were other immediate priorities. The symposium also recommended a Highway of Tears governing body something connected to the eventual Highway of Tears initiative under CSFS.
We should say CSFS, Carrier Sekani Family Services, has been central in the community response. They run the Highway of Tears initiative and have pushed the calls for justice. Listeners can find them at highwayoftears.org. Leanne, some policy steps were taken. A bus service announced in 2016 and improved cell coverage more recently. Have those changes made a meaningful difference?
They've helped in targeted ways. The 2016 provincial announcement introduced a public transit network along parts of Highway 16, direct routes, and community shuttles, but service remains uneven. People still hitchhike for early morning appointments, late-night travel, or to and from remote side roads and communities not directly on the routes. Improved cell coverage in the 2020s has reduced some risks, but gaps remain. The point is, incremental improvements matter, but they don't erase decades of risk or solve underlying problems like poverty, housing insecurity, child welfare, or the legacy of colonial policies.
So change has been partial. Some wins, but far from comprehensive.
Right.
Let's talk about the National Inquiry, 2016 to 2019. Because it reframed the issue nationally. The report used the term genocide and gave 231 calls for justice. How does that connect back to the Highway of Tears?
The National Inquiry's final report framed the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people as a form of genocide rooted in colonial structures. Many of the inquiry's 231 calls for justice map directly onto the Highway of Tears recommendations: safe transportation, policing reform, independent oversight, changes in media practices, and education about colonial histories. The Highway of Tears is both a local tragedy and a symbol of the national pattern the inquiry documented. The problem is that governments have been criticized for slow and uneven implementation of the calls for justice. Implementation needs sustained, adequately funded work at provincial, federal, and community levels.
And when the inquiry calls for changes, it also elevates local leadership. CSFS and the Highway of Tears governing body are examples of Indigenous-led solutions. Leanne, I want to ask you something that's difficult but necessary. How do we balance talking about serial killers, because true crime coverage loves that, with the structural realities you've been describing?
That tension shows up all the time. Media and public fascination often teaches us to look for one culprit, one villain, a singular monster. But in this case, while there have been serial killers active in the region, the larger story is about many perpetrators, opportunistic predators, and the systemic conditions that made violence predictable. Focusing only on the serial killer narrative risks turning victims into plot devices and obscuring things like inadequate transit, racism in policing, poverty, the child welfare system, and colonial histories. Our storytelling needs to hold both, recognize clear criminal actors where they exist, but place crimes inside the framework of structural violence and community harm.
So, true crime as a genre has to be handled carefully, especially where families are still grieving. Speaking ethically, what should podcasters and journalists avoid when telling these stories?
Avoid exploitation and sensationalism. Don't fixate on graphic details for shock value. Center victims' lives, not just the how of their deaths. Don't name suspects who were never charged, because that can be libelous and hurtful. Use trauma-informed practices, warn listeners about graphic content, give families agency over their narratives, and prioritize Indigenous voices and leadership. And don't let the story become a museum piece. These are ongoing harms requiring ongoing action.
Good guidance. Thank you. Leanne, what about media bias? We mentioned Nikal Hoare earlier and how her disappearance drew more attention. What does that say about how newsrooms treat victims?
It's an ugly but persistent truth. Mainstream media often pays more attention to non-Indigenous or white middle-class victims. That differential attention reproduces a hierarchy of whose lives are considered newsworthy. Families see that and are rightly outraged. It's why media reform, framing, language choice, centering Indigenous sources is part of the calls for justice. Journalists need to interrogate who they focus on and why.
Leanne, I want to ask about the human side families who've kept searching for decades. What does that look like? And what does it cost families to keep pushing?
It's relentless. Mothers, sisters, friends keep rooms intact, hold memorial walks, raise money for searches, put up billboards, organize vigils, and testify at inquiries. The emotional labor is enormous. Many become frontline advocates and community leaders, people like Mary T.G. at CSFS, who turned personal grief into organizing and service work. There's also financial cost, families paying for their own searches, travel, and sometimes legal help. The burden is enormous and often unsupported by adequate government services.
Mary T.G.'s leadership is a real anchor in this story. CSFS has done a lot to build culturally appropriate responses. Leanne, we're getting towards the middle of our conversation. Let's step back and recap. What are the key structural drivers that keep making this corridor dangerous?
Short list. Remoteness and isolation. Lack of reliable transportation forcing hitchhiking. Poverty and marginalization. Disruption from colonial policies, residential schools, child welfare removals. Inadequate policing response shaped by racism. And, until recently, limited cell coverage and emergency infrastructure. Together, these conditions create opportunities for predators and leave victims and families with fewer protections and less recourse.
Right. Those conditions don't exist in a vacuum. Now, some listeners will hear this and want to know what concrete things have improved and where are the biggest gaps?
Improvements. Some bus services have been established along stretches of Highway 16 since the 2016 announcement. Cell coverage has increased in the 2020s. There's more national attention because of the inquiry's calls for justice, and Indigenous organizations like CSFS have strengthened local services and advocacy. Gaps remain in sustainable funding for those services, full implementation of police reforms and independent oversight, comprehensive transit that serves all communities and times of day, and deeper work on poverty, housing, child welfare, and the legacies of residential schools. Those systemic issues demand long-term investments rather than quick fixes.
And funding cuts to EPANA were a real problem, dropping over 80% in the early 2010s. That tells families something about political will, doesn't it?
It certainly does. When resources shrink, it sends a message that the cases are no longer a priority. Families experience that as a betrayal. It also means fewer specialized investigators and less forensic work, so cold cases go colder. That's why many families and advocates call for sustained, well-funded, and transparent efforts.
Leanne, quickly, because I want to ask about local accountability. How do communities hold police and governments to account? What levers exist?
Families and communities have used public inquiries, symposiums, media, memorial walks, and legal challenges to keep pressure on institutions. Indigenous-run organizations like CSFS spearhead local responses and collaborate with allies to demand action. The National Inquiry's calls for justice provide a roadmap, and sovereign First Nations governance bodies can push for agreements and services in their territories. But accountability is uneven. It depends on sustained public attention, political will, and the ability to enforce recommendations with funding and oversight.
And public attention fades when stories drop out of the headlines.
Exactly. That's why repeat memorial events, the annual walks and billboards matter. They keep memory alive and maintain pressure.
Leanne, I want to turn to something you mentioned earlier, men and masculinity. It's a sensitive subject, but it's part of the picture. How do communities address violence that comes from within without feeding racist stereotypes about Indigenous men?
This is delicate but necessary. Some offenders are Indigenous men, many are non-Indigenous. Community leaders and Indigenous feminists emphasize naming and addressing patriarchal violence within communities while resisting racist narratives that pathologize Indigenous people as a whole. That means programs focused on healthy masculinities, accountability, and cultural renewal. It also means not using community accountability as a way for external actors to excuse their own failures or to push punitive policies that harm rights. The key is community-led prevention that blends cultural healing with concrete safety measures.
That's a thoughtful framing prevention rooted in culture, not punishment alone. Leanne, we've covered history, policy, families, and perpetrators. If someone listening wants to learn more or help in a meaningful way, where should they go?
Start with Carrier Sakani Family Services and the Highway of Tears Initiative, highwayoftears.org. Support Indigenous-led organizations working on prevention, victim services, and community healing. Pay attention to the National Inquiry's 231 calls for justice and advocate for governments to implement them fully. And if you're a journalist or podcaster, follow trauma-informed practices and center Indigenous voices in your work.
Important steps. Leanne, I want to close with a human story to underline what this is about. We could name any number of women: Monica Ignis, Helen Frost, Ramona Lisa Wilson. But tell me, why is it essential to keep saying their names?
Because these are real lives. Daughters, mothers, sisters, nieces, each with relationships and stories that outlived the headlines. Saying names resists erasure. It reminds us that the failures here aren't abstract, they're intimate and ongoing. Families keep saying those names because they insist that a missing daughter's story matters enough to change policy so others are safer. Naming ensures memory, pushes accountability, and honors the person, not just the case number.
Leanne, thank you. Before we wrap, a few quick interruptions. Some shorter, some just to breathe. Wow.
Yeah.
I see.
Right.
Leanne, any last thought you want to leave listeners with?
We need sustained action transit, cell coverage, culturally rooted services, transparent policing reforms, and funding that lasts. But we also need to listen to families and respect their leadership. Healing comes through community-led solutions and through structural change. Keep the pressure on those with power to act.
And for those looking for more context, read Jessica McDarmid's book, Highway of Tears. Watch the documentary, Highway of Tears, and visit highwayoftears.org to connect with CSFS resources and updates on the initiative. This is not a closed book. These are not stories confined to the past.
No. They're living, ongoing stories. And the work continues.
We'll be following that work, and we'll keep centering the families, the survivors, and the people leading the changes. Thank you again, Dr. Leanne Wesley, for joining me. Your perspective is invaluable.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you for holding space for this conversation.
To our listeners, we end with a few concrete things. 1, visit highwayoftears.org to learn more about the Highway of Tears initiative and Carrier Sekani Family Services. 2, read the National Inquiry's Calls for Justice. 3, if you're a journalist, adopt trauma-informed practices and amplify Indigenous leadership. And finally, honor the lives of the missing and murdered by keeping their names and stories alive. This episode of Still Unanswered was produced with respect for the families whose lives are at the center of this story. We will continue to follow developments, including the 20th anniversary of the 2006 Highway of Tears Symposium in 2026, which CFSS has signaled will be a moment for reckoning and renewal. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.